God will leave his home and destroy it altogether, but he will return to rebuild it into something better. At the beginning of Ezekiel, Israel is wondering why they are in exile, why their home had been trampled, why the Babylonians had taken all but their last stronghold in the temple. There were one of two reasons. Either God had forgotten his people, or, as their captors said, their God was beaten. The exiles needed an answer and a reason, so God appeared to Ezekiel in a vision. Ezekiel would be God's watchman, like a lookout on a city wall. He would see what God would show him and report to the exiles what he saw. And what he saw was the glory of God moving in a chariot that was also God's throne. Ezekiel saw God riding out like a warrior king, but he was riding back toward Ezekiel's home. God had not been beaten, neither had this king forgotten his people. Rather, he was the one who drove them out of Israel. God will leave his home and destroy it altogether, but he will return to rebuild it into something better. Ezekiel shared these visions with those with him in exile. He told them it wasn't the Babylonians, their armies or weapons that truly warred against them. It was God himself. God was on his chariot riding toward Jerusalem because of his people's rebellion. They had worshipped the false gods of these pagan nations. It was because of their sin that God was riding out against them. But Israel's leaders and prophets were twisted. Her shepherds were evil. They reminded the exiles of the still standing temple. Surely that must be a sign, a symbol that God was still with them and would soon bring them back in to Israel. But Ezekiel was given his own signs and symbols to perform for the people. Their cities would be crushed like clay under an iron griddle. Their people would dwell among unclean Gentiles like good food that had been soiled. And like Ezekiel cut off his own beard and burned it in front of his people, so God would cut Israel off from their land and destroy them for their evil. But the exiles preferred the words of their false shepherds and prophets, finding comfort in their false visions that Israel's temple could never be demolished. But God showed Ezekiel true visions that his plans would surely be accomplished. The Lord would withdraw from the temple, which his people thought would keep him caged. God would leave the home where his people thought he had to stay. That's the point of the chariot Ezekiel saw, to prove that God cannot be contained. For the chariot was carried by whirling wheels, all covered in eyes, to show that God goes everywhere and sees everything. He had never been constrained. God was always able to ride. But from his withdrawing chariot, he would also provide. For though he rode out from Israel into battle against Babylon, he would also ride. For Babylon was wicked, and God would punish their sin. He would defeat Babylon from his throne-like chariot and would dwell with his people again. In fact, every wicked nation would have God ride against them. God would remove every threat from every nation that ever held his people in contempt. He would bring Israel back into their land to plant their own vineyards and dwell in their own tents. But before their deliverance could start, the temple would have to be brought to an end. And that is when Ezekiel is interrupted from his prophecies, when a messenger comes from Jerusalem to tell them that his visions had become a reality. The temple, Israel's last stronghold, had faced Babylon's brutality. And the withdrawal of God's presence Ezekiel saw was no longer a vision, but an actuality. The temple was gone, Israel empty. Their punishment had come. God's chariot had ridden to victory. God left his home and destroyed it altogether. Would he return? Could he rebuild it into something better? But in the middle of their tragedy, God came to Ezekiel and led him into a vision of what he would make them to be. Though Israel was dead, like a city filled with dry bones, God would raise them to life and rebuild their home. And the home he would make, the lives he would recreate, would be far greater than what the Babylonians erased. The temple would be like an entire city. The people would be safe forever in its walls. God would no longer ride against them for their sins, but would transform their hearts to obey his laws. And the best part of this new temple, this city, this garden with healing food and guarding gates, is that God himself would fill it, living forever with his people in this new holy place. God left his home and destroyed it altogether, but he would return to rebuild it into something better. God promised this would be accomplished when he would once again leave his home. However, it wouldn't be the earthly temple he left, but the heavenly home he has dwelled in forever. God would return on his chariot again, coming as king and shepherd. But this time, when the king came to Israel, when the shepherd visited his people, this time when destruction came to the temple, it would be the temple of his own body that would be destroyed on the cross. Jesus, the good shepherd and king, would be destroyed instead of us. Jesus left his home and was destroyed altogether. But he rose from the dead to rebuild something better. This was Ezekiel's vision, the good news of what Jesus would do through his death, burial, and resurrection. And just as God told Ezekiel, Jesus tells us to keep watch for the next time he leaves his home. That is when the old heaven and the old earth will pass away altogether, and we will rise from the dead and live in the rebuilt world with Jesus forever. Hey everyone, I'm David with Spoken Gospel. Thank you so much for watching our video explaining the book of Ezekiel. We are Spoken Gospel, a nonprofit dedicated to speaking the gospel out of every corner of Scripture, and we are only able to do that because of people like you who give a little bit of what they can every month or one time to help support our mission. So if you want to support what we're doing or see all of our free resources, you can head over to spokengospel.com.